I have Tony Thomas here from Australia.
I've been a journalist since 1958 when I first left school. I went to the West Australian newspaper doing news and light features. I also studied literature part-time at the university for 8 years, which might seem odd, but I actually wanted to be an English lecturer in academia. I'm glad I never fulfilled that one. So in 1971, I switched to economics and business coverage, and I retired from paid journalism in 2001, but I continue writing unpaid for a writer-centred blog called Quadrant Online. And I keep a check, and in the past 10 years, I've published 460 essays there, which is about 1 million words. So all up, I've been reporting for 65 years, and I'm about to turn 83. But I should be in my dressing gown watching daytime TV, but I like writing about climate. I've also authored about close to about a dozen books on anthropology, business, history, current affairs and climate, including 5 book collections of my Quadrant essays. I really like to make my stuff funny. The most effective weapon against climate cultists is to play back their own overblown nonsense, and academics are my favourite target. I can tell you a bit about my climate writing. My first article for Quadrant in 2012 was about the supposedly drowning Pacific Islands, which in fact are growing in area. Their problem is high birth rates and destructive lifestyles. It's not rising seas at all. But this drowning island myth never dies. And in fact, just a fortnight ago, I forced our government-funded ABC TV to correct their latest Tuvalu item, which they really hate doing. It's called a Dracula statistic about the Pacific Islands drowning because it never dies. My first big climate article was titled The Fictive World of Rajendra Pachauri, an expose about the longtime chair of the IPCC. He hastily resigned later, a decade ago, because he was caught out groping his young female staff. The second article was the integrity of the Australian Academy of Science, which no one had ever questioned before, I can tell you. I interviewed the president, who's a microbiologist called Suzanne Corey, and she readily agreed with me, because she was new in the job, that climate science at that time, 2012, was not settled. Now, this was absolute heresy. You might remember in those days, climate science was supposed to be settled, and her climate minders soon got her to change her tune. In here in Australia, both political parties, sadly, aspire to net zero CO2 by 2050. The 2030 target, would you believe, involves installing 22,000 solar panels a day for the next 8 years and more than one maxi-sized wind turbine every day. These days, I happily write on the emerging train wreck as green politics combines with energy realities. So you probably want to know what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll talk about the world's mainstream climate journalists and the many third-party institutions that are snowing them with alarmist stuff. These institutions warn them off accessing skeptic material, and they shower them with money and honours for writing the net zero and alarmist lines. I began this researching a month or two ago, and every time I check out one of these organisations influencing the media behind the scenes, I discover new ones out of left field. They're breeding like rabbits. A week ago, I noticed that Matt, I don't know how to pronounce this, Taibbi, and he's the chap who outed the censorship via Twitter and Elon Musk. He did a fabulous job. Anyway, Matt has just published a report on the censorship industrial complex, which is a compendium or an encyclopedia of no less than 50 government, big tech and NGOs feeding the approved lines to the media and shutting down opposing views and platforms. So, in fact, we've both been working in parallel, me in my little way in Australia and him with his team of 8 in America, working on the same topic. Who's manipulating the media behind the scenes? And my conclusion is a little bit odd. I've found it costs very little to set up an outfit to bias the climate media. Some of these groups have got huge results from budgets of just $5, $10 or $20 million. And when you think about the money washing around, the trillions in climate, $5 or $10 million is just pocket change. Moreover, the climate propaganda is usually wrapped up inside a platform of worthy roles like training third world reporters to do a good job. So I'm ignoring the feel-good side of this and just concentrating on where the dirty tricks are. So I'll go through a few of these, and I'll start with BBC Verify. Now, I mentioned groups just popping up everywhere, and this popped up only this week. I picked up material about the BBC boasting about its truth-checking, which it calls BBC Verify. You can Google up a BBC News video from yesterday by a lady called Mariana Spring, who's got a title there at the BBC of Disinformation and Social Media Correspondent for BBC Verify. She uses several dummy accounts to keep tabs on what's going on in the social media, looking for unapproved things. She targets what she calls conspiracy theory newspapers, alternative media, the UK conspiracy movement, and those dreadful far-right figures and local communities. So you can guess what this is really all about. Now, I find it pretty rich for the BBC to be carrying on about conspiracies when it's the source of its own conspiracy, which is called 28 Gate. It dates right back from 2006. The BBC pretended that a group of 28 external, quote, best scientific experts, unquote, had advised the BBC not to give climate skeptics any more coverage. Well, after many years of FOI battles to drag out the names of these 28 people, and the BBC using 3 top barristers and probably spending $100,000 to stop it, finally it came out by accident that the 28 best scientific experts comprise only 3 scientists, not 28, and a mob of 25 Greenpeace and other activists, vested business interests, and even somebody from the US Embassy. So much for the best scientific experts. But the particular conspiracy was to keep these names concealed. The BBC knew darn well that they'd been lying about them. And then in 2018, the BBC policy reaffirmed to deny skeptics any platform on the BBC. Well, the next one is called Trusted News Initiative. You might have actually played this one through before. This was launched by the BBC, and its core membership is the newswires, which are huge, Associated Press, AFP, Reuters, Washington Post, and Australia's government-owned broadcaster ABC. Trusted News has partnered with the online giants Meta, which is Facebook, Google, YouTube, and Microsoft, to rapidly flag what it calls climate and health misinformation. Trusted News finds something it doesn't like somewhere and spreads the word instantly at the speed of light among all its members, so they can all attack it all at the same time. So they set about kneecapping these sites by warning off advertisers and destroying their income. They've already destroyed many popular right-of-centre sites in America, and one victim is Robert Kennedy Jr., nephew of JFK, who's suing Trusted News for treble damages on antitrust grounds. The lawsuit by Robert Kennedy Jr. is about 70 dense pages, and if you read it, you pick up all sorts of amazing stuff about what's been going on with this, quote, Trusted News Initiative. So well done, ABC. Well, seeing I'm Australian and I've got a funny accent, I'll tell you about about the Australia's #1 climate manipulator of the media. It's called the Climate Council. And it's got a stranglehold on the media here that extends right out into the Pacific. It's led by Australia's most influential alarmist called Dr. Tim Flannery. Have you ever heard of him? Probably not. You have?
I have.
Oh.
I have a lot, yeah.
Ah, right. Well, his qualifications are actually in mammal paleontology, which has nothing to do with climate. His predictions have been as bad as Paul Ehrlich, and I don't need to remind our readers just how bad Paul Ehrlich's predictions have been. We had a huge drought here 15 years ago, and he predicted it would be permanent and that 2 of our capital cities would become waterless ghost towns. So the state governments who believed him spent billions of dollars installing seawater desalinations that have never been used, because the problem became not drought, but floods. A great flood washed down the whole of the eastern side of Australia, and we've had a repeat of it just in the last year. Well, what's his Climate Council? How does it all work? Well, it's chaired by the daughter of a billionaire, and it runs on quite a modest budget of $6 million. I'm using US dollars here instead of confusing you with our feeble Australian dollars. I calculate most funding now is from tycoons and the usual foundations like the Rockefellers. It has several investors in renewables on its board with no concern about conflict of interest. In fact, one top alarmist scientist here, Dr. David Caroli, who's a very big cheese in the climate world, was quoted, quote, "The ability to make money while simultaneously solving climate change can be an appealing proposition to people with deep pockets." The council includes a huge 20-member media spin team. It's incredibly successful in planting stories in the media, and time after time when I see stories, I recognise the fingerprints of the council behind the reporting. Now, you won't believe these figures, but last year in the small country of Australia, the council, according to its annual report, helped create 22,000 media stories, or 800 a week. For example, reporters here originally just reported plainly on bushfires and floods without any spin. Then the council influencers got to work on them, on these journalists, so they began routinely calling the fires and floods, quote, climate caused or climate fueled, which is one of their favourite expressions. In the council's own words, it has well socialised journalists to parrot this alarmism. One effective technique has been to create a standing committee of first responders to weather disasters, like firefighters, emergency service leaders, and medicos. They brief the reporters as if they have credibility in climate science rather than rescuing old ladies from their flooded rooftops. The council found and trained another 200 local leaders of all description as what they call trusted voices for the media to speak the climate message. And this is because they know that grassroots local material is much more influential than any big picture science reporting. It's also saturated the local governments here with climate alarm. It's got 175 councils signed up to what it calls a climate emergency. You know all about that. And those councils cover 70% of the Australian population. The council actually trains journalists formally in workshops run with the Journalists' Union. And the goal is partly to inoculate them against sceptic arguments, claiming these are misinformation. So I've got some typical journo education from the council, and here's some propositions that they're telling these journalists. Coal and gas are expensive compared with renewables. Renewables are reliable. Renewables creates net jobs, and Australia can make a difference to the world climate, even though it does only 1% and a bit of the emissions. So that's the sort of crap that the council is basically educating climate journalists about, and frankly, a lot of these climate journalists haven't got a clue and they just believe it all. The council claims to be non-political, but in fact it wades into federal election campaigning and for Green candidates implicitly. It helped remove the Conservative government in last year's elections and bring in our present radical government, which is completely and utterly crazy about climate. The council CEO is a young woman who's passionate, she's smart, she's wholesome, and she's very photogenic. So how can we grizzled old skeptics ever hope to compete with her? Well, the next one I'm going to give you is Covering Climate Now. This is the most sinister and effective global influencer and manipulator of the media. It has more than 500 media outlets signed up, pledging to hype climate alarm and suppress critical views. Its claimed Climate CC Now members have 2 billion readers in 60 countries. So who are these media outlets that have signed up? The really big ones are Reuters, Bloomberg, and Agence France-Presse, pardon my French. Many, if most, US TV and radio outlets have signed up. And what's really deplorable is that the science journals Nature and Scientific America have joined CC Now and signed away their objectivity. So nothing you read anymore in the Nature journal can you trust, because they have pledged to hype up and boost the climate science alarm story. So CC Now was started 4 years ago by The Guardian, very leftist, of course, The Nation magazine, which I don't know, and the Columbia School of Journalism. It wants to make climate a part of every beat in the newsroom, from politics and weather to business and culture and plenty else. It showers reporters with resources and story templates and pushes absurdities like 1 billion climate refugees by the year 2050. Given that The Guardian is a key member, it's not surprising that the founders view fossil fuel executives as criminals against humanity. They also want to, quote, revoke the social licenses, unquote, of deniers in the same way tobacco companies were shafted last century. Now, I've looked into what the CC Now style guide is for the world's media, and here's some samples. Bottom line, I'm quoting them, there's no excuse to skip the climate connection in your stories. Here's some simple language to help. Here we go. This heat wave is exactly the sort of extreme weather that scientists around the world associate with climate change or a warming planet. This hurricane comes at a time when human-caused climate change is consistently making storms more intense. It tells journalists, you can also try an analogy or turn of phrase. Climate change isn't solely to blame for extreme weather, but it stacks the deck against us. It's baked in with our weather and often a key ingredient in the outcome. It supercharges normal weather patterns like steroids. So it's basically telling the journalists how to inject this emotional nonsense into their stories. I had trouble rooting out who funds CC Now, and I couldn't quite understand it because all the others, they've got public information, charities, filings, and so on. And then I discovered that even the What's Up With That blog tried to find out the funders a couple of years ago and failed. So all they could do was suggest it was the usual gaggle of leftist foundations. Well, I mentioned Agence France-Presse, or AFP, and I'll give you a closer look at what it's all about. It's got 1,700 journalists operating in 150 countries. We're not talking Mickey Mouse stuff here. It's independent, but it gets about 40% of its funding from the French government. AFP signed the CC Now pledge to hype climate alarm despite its clear ethical code. And this code says AFP may under no circumstances take account of influences or considerations liable to compromise the objectivity of its information. It may under no circumstances fall under the control of any ideological, political, or economic grouping. So it just doesn't compute. AFP signs this thing pledging itself to be a propaganda outfit, and at the same time, its ethical code says that this is absolutely impossible for AFP. AFP readers are getting their global warming fix from AFP's specialist reporter, Marlo Hood, who has the title, wait for it, Global Coordinator for Climate Change. This journo has laughably self-titled himself Senior Editor, Future of the Planet. He tells us he was born at 314 parts per million. That's when CO2 was 314 parts per million. And he now calls himself, you won't believe this, a herald of the Anthropocene. A herald of the Anthropocene. His stories have headlines like Acceleration of Global Warming, Code Red for Humanity, and Climate Cataclysms Set Stage for Key UN Science Report. Where did he get all this from? He says he was at an Oxford conference in 2009 on supposed impacts of a supposed 4-degree centigrade warming. So he's described it, quote, and suddenly the reality of global warming and the human misery it will trail in its wake hit me in the gut and left me gasping for air. Humanity is standing at the crossroads of a 6th mass extinction. Well, I mentioned the prizes and rewards, and it's well worth fossicking around, seeing what sort of money do these sort of people collect for their output. So this environmental journo Rat Pack gets huge gobs of cash. This Mr. Hood pocketed a $110,000 prize from Spain's BBVA leftist foundation 2 years ago. Elizabeth Colbert, you might have heard of her, she's the writer for The New Yorker who's peddled her ridiculous 6th extinction scare for the past 8 years. Well, she picked up a Heinz prize of $100,000 from the wife of Biden's loopy special presidential envoy for climate, John Kerry. Then she got another $110,000 award from the same BBVA last September. The BBC's not very accurate climate journalist Matt McGrath got the same BBVA $110,000 windfall in 2019, ironically for his accurate reporting, unquote. Typical McGrath scare stuff was from the IPC confab in Korea in 2018, quote, final call to save the world from climate catastrophe. Now, as you know, Tom, there's been an awful lot of final calls since then. Covering Climate Now itself hands out prizes like confetti, and so do academies like the Arizona State University, which on Earth Day last year handed out cash to climate writers for their pieces headed, Is it okay to have a child? And In Search of Environmental Hope, and A Year's Diary of Reckoning with Climate Anxiety. All well worth a big prize. A special mention by Arizona University involved an essay chapter aptly titled The Great Derangement. I'll move on to Earth Journalism Network. I wrote about this the other day in Quadrant, and I've got a bit of play in the US, which I was happy about. So Earth Journalism Network is a UK-based group which targets journalists in the third world to spread the alarmist message. That's probably why we haven't really picked it up very much. It's sponsored by and owned by a bigger group called Internews, which was created to, so to speak, help improve third world journalism. Internews Europe has a twin relationship with Internews US. When combined, the pair claim to be the world's second or third largest media supporting group. I don't know quite how they measure it, but anyway, that's what they're claiming. It claims to have trained 15,000 third world reporters to produce more than 15,000 stories. And the network writes climate stories itself to plant in third world countries with grateful reporters. It woos these low-income journos with a host of small money grants, and it's distributed 500 plus fellowships so far. Indeed, the network has had more than 11,000 journalists apply for its money, and 1,000 of them did walk off with some money, all in the guise of grants for better reporting and grants for special stories and all sorts of euphemisms like that. The network pays for dozens or scores of these journalists to get a great trip to the big climate conferences, especially the annual United Nations COPs. The network even provides money to small third world news organisations, many of which are financially struggling. And of course, once they've taken the money, you can imagine they're not going to go and contradict anything from covering Earth Journalism Network. The network knows how important, and this is quite significant, the visuals and graphics are to the stories. So it has 10 regional centres pumping out net zero friendly graphics for free use in the third world. And this is in common with a lot of these organisations. They know that it's very difficult doing these fancy charts and diagrams and graphics and stuff. And so they provide them all, and the media just lap them up. I can't find out how much this network's paid out, but only that it's what are called sub-grants, total $3 million. Well, it's not a large amount, but on the other hand, $1,000 to a third world journalist in Bangladesh is a pretty big lick. So who's funding it? It's just the usual, the Hewletts, the Packards, the Rockefellers, but it's got giants like the European Commission, the UN aid agencies, and the governments themselves of the US, UK, and Sweden behind it. Now, I found a wonderful case study on how it woos journalists, in this case in South Africa, giving them ideas and templates for their stories. So here's a couple of their prompts to the South African journalists. What risks will South Africa face if it fails to transition to a low-carbon economy by 2050? In contrast, what benefits will the country enjoy from aligning its climate commitment to its development agenda? And here's another one. How is the climate change bill poised to solidify South Africa's commitment towards reaching net zero? Well, I imagine by now you know what the latest on South Africa is. The grid is about to collapse. What's the reality? It's facing blackouts even worse than the 10 to 12 hours a day at present. More than half the country, possibly 80%, is without electricity, without any electricity at any given time. It's now preparing for blackouts, even as long as 32 hours, to prevent collapse of the grid. And it appears that South Africa is on the edge of a total blackout. In fact, the news I was watching at 7 o'clock tonight said the same thing. And this is thanks to incompetence, corruption, and especially the absurd South African renewables and anti-coal policies. But Earth Network is helping to ensure the media sticks with the net zero advocacy. And on this broadcast at 7 o'clock tonight, I was waiting to hear them say, well, the problem there is partly renewables. And all they said was that the problem was corruption causing coal mines to be sabotaged. And they actually went on to say that the solution to South Africa's problems is to go more into green renewables, which it sounds like this network has really got to the reporters there. Well, I came across one. It's a little bit strange, but it's quite significant. It's called NewsGuard, and I noticed it because it launched in Australia a couple of months ago after being very big in the US, partnering with Microsoft. And what it does is flagging health and climate websites with green or red flags, depending whether NewsGuard approves of them. You can add NewsGuard as an extension to your browser for a token amount like $50 a year. And once it's on your browser, all the websites that are okay come up with a green tick, and any that are naughty come up with a red tick. And what NewsGuard is really all about is to drive advertising revenue away from the unapproved red tick sites. Well, who funds NewsGuard? It's the Liberal Knight Foundation, something called Publicis that I don't know about, and a trail of the usual others. Well, in Australia, it's already red flagged 20% of the Australian sites it's looked at. In the US, it's red flagged nearly half the sites it's looked at. Almost any skeptic claim leads to red flagging, and keep in mind Microsoft is partnering in all this, such as extreme events not being fueled by climate or sea level rise not accelerating. It's even now rating TV and news and talk shows. The fearful part is NewsGuard's broad reach. It targets journalists, bureaucrats, and so far 900 libraries with 7 million users, plus schools all over the place. I can imagine a teacher shying away from letting kids look at a red flagged site. But all it is NewsGuard's in-house liberal journalists and activists choosing these colours. Well, my final look is at Science Feedback, which is based in France, and again, it's not all that well known. It claims to use blue chip scientists to combat misinformation to protect democracy. Of course, apparently you protect democracy by shutting down views that you don't like. It supposedly fact checks and gives a score to climate and vaccine articles so that journalists and editors can work out whether they're okay to use. The Science Feedback website says climate feedback and health feedback use on-call academics to quickly highlight hype or spin in news reports and warn reporters against repeating misstatements of fact. So the key thing is their fast reaction time. As soon as somebody, Anthony Watts or somebody has an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, this Science Feedback crowd will be onto it. They'll get scientists to, quote, debunk it, unquote. They'll be warning off other journalists for repeating it or believing it and so on. Well, I mentioned the tiny amounts of revenue that can be involved, and this crowd's revenue is only $1 million, and it finances 16 staff. But it's used by the giants like the New York Times, Washington Post, PolitiFact, Guardian, BBC, and so on. And guess who's part funding it? The Chinese-controlled TikTok. Science Feedback also partners with TikTok to check viral videos for misinformation. I mean, what a joke. Something controlled by the Chinese Communist Party is fact-checking videos in the United States. So the other funders of this group are Meta and Facebook, the giants, the International Fact-Checking Network, which I'm sure you've heard of, and basically tries to debunk anything that doesn't go along with the liberal line, and Google News Initiative, which I've mentioned has got 300 million Google funding behind it. Science Feedback laughably claims to be non-partisan, but I've counted 10 fact checks against Australia's Professor Ian Plimer, a leading Australian skeptic geologist, who was actually on that CFACT conference in America a month ago, which seems a bit obsessive to do 10 fact checks on one man. I found no fact checks of everyone who's claimed the Great Barrier Reef is dying right now when it's actually showing record coral cover. In recent months, Science Feedback was among the consortium going after Elon Musk and Twitter. Science Feedbacks, like other liberal groups, was working or continues to work to deprive unapproved sites of advertising. So the next question is, who are these academics, these Science Feedback, non-partisan scientists? Well, they're the usual suspects: Michael Mann, Kevin Trenberth of ClimateGate fame, Stephen Rahmstorff of the extremist Potsdam Institute, Peter Gleich, who was involved in an ethics scandal 10 years back, which he said he, quote, deeply regretted, unquote, and Gavin Schmidt of NASA. So I'm sure all those names are thoroughly familiar to you. Now, in the Australian context, I recognise the standard alarmist scientists like Sarah Perkins Kilpatrick, who attributes weather extremes to warming for the benefit of the news media, and three of those barrier reef scientists that I just mentioned. Now, there's also a data quality expert from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. Now, the Bureau right now is in the firing line for very low quality temperature recording and refusal to allow critics access to check it. You know, Joanne Noter and Jennifer Marahosi have been really crucifying the Bureau of Meteorology over this. Well, a number of the Australian scientists on the science feedback panel are actually notorious for doing a disgusting rap video a decade ago about, I won't try and sing it, where climate bleep scientists, what we say is true, sucking bleep in Copenhagen. Now, it wasn't even juvenile. They were professors and they were postdoctorates singing this. And who wants such people steering the transformation of our society for the worse, of course? Well, I've looked at a few more media manipulators like the Oxford University Climate Journalism Network that is very influential in Europe. Climate Central is America and Point is America. But I really think I've talked long enough, Tom. And so sum up in 5 words: don't trust the media on climate. Thanks.
Excellent stuff. I really appreciate you doing that. I'm curious about how do you do your research? It's clear that you do enormous amounts of research. Do you find all this stuff on your own, or do you work with anybody else?
Oh, entirely on my own. I've got a couple of good guys who I can sometimes throw a tough question to them because I'm not a scientist myself, and they'll come back and help me out. But basically, I'm a lone wolf here, and I sit at my laptop and annoy my wife for never getting off it. And I just comb the internet and I build up a huge volume of material into a file. It might be 30 or 40,000 words. And then I start refining it down. And as I do this, I begin to see a theme and a way to write the story. And then I use all my journalistic smarts from 65 years to make my material entertaining. And that's pretty important because you can write a brilliant article, but if it's not entertaining, people don't have that incentive to read it. I mean, they like nothing better than a good laugh as they're reading. There'd be 6 or 8 top skeptic sites that I monitor every morning. And I'm good mates with Joanne Nova. In point of fact, we're both Perth people, and we have dinner together or lunch together whenever we get the chance, which is not very often. But nobody really helps me. I've got the experience to knock this stuff out unaided. So, as I said, lone wolf will sum me up.
Very good. In the show notes here, I have a link to your books on Connor Court Publishing, and also under Quadrant, I do a search for your name to find your articles. How else can we find your work? Are you on any other social media or anything?
No. Quadrant Online, which is quadrant.org.au, is the best way to get into it, and then search on Tony Thomas.
So, how do you think the fight is going against this, against the alarmists right now? You've been watching this fight for a long time. Is it swinging in our realist direction at all, or how's it going?
Well, in Australia, the answer, sadly, has to be no. The population has just elected a climate crazy government. You can't believe how crazy it is. But in point of fact, they only got about 33% of the primary vote, but the Greens and other pals gave them preferences, and so that got them over the line. If you look at the Conservative vote, it also was not very big on primaries, but with the help of some other splinter right groups, they weren't far short of 50%. But the trouble is that we do have one excellent national newspaper called The Australian, and it's got an excellent climate reporter called Graham Lloyd, but he just stands alone as willing to give both sides a fair go. And he's very incisive himself, and he's very switched on to things like Jennifer Marahazi and the Australian Bureau of Met's funny business and dirty tricks. But all the rest of the media, and especially this colossus, the government-funded Australian Broadcasting Commission, which gets $1 billion a year for its news and reporting, they're all as left as hell and green left as hell. And all our skeptics, we're all over done 60, they were over 70, we're over bloody 80, and all the youth are being brainwashed through the school system. And as they come out, I reckon they go 70 to 80% green as they come out of the school and university system. It's really sinister, and it's almost unbelievable how kids are brainwashed. This goes on for something like 12 or 13 years. And by that time, of course, they're conditioned like Pavlov dogs, and they'd have to have a giant intellect to push back against the indoctrination that's been going on. So, in a word, the answer to your question is I'm pessimistic, but we're going to hit the wall on energy. We're going to be another South Africa down the track unless they see sanity. And by the time Germany and a few other countries, England, and New York City, San Francisco, by the time they've all hit the wall, the message might start to come through. But even then, it'll be blamed on everything but their own renewables policy. Just like on the news tonight on South Africa, they blamed nothing but criminals sabotaging coal plants and telling us that the solution is more renewables. So it's going to take a long while for the public basically to wake up.
Do you think there's anything specific that we should be doing that we're not doing to wake up the public or to counter the brainwashing? Anything?
Well, we've got an excellent conservative think tank called the Institute of Public Affairs, which is considerably to the right, even of the right opposition we have, and they do an excellent job. But what can we do? We're all going to die off. That's the trouble. We're all so old, and the new youngsters aren't coming through. There's a few, but they're completely swamped. So unfortunately, I just write the news. I don't try and find solutions. In point of fact, there's a whole breed of journalism called solutions journalism, and the journalists, the liberal ones, are expected to always provide the solution to all the world's problems on climate, as well as simply writing about it. So basically, they're just propaganda morons, these people. So I don't want to get into that game of saying that I've got the solution. I don't.
Thank you very much. I'll let you go. And Tony Thomas, talk to you later.
Thanks.
Yeah, goodbye.